about OPT. So I'm going to do the OPT and STEM OPT portion of the presentation. For those of you that aren't aware, OPT stands for Optional Practical Training. It's a employment authorization granted primarily after graduation. We'll talk about that in a second here. Um, and it's employment authorization approved directly through the federal government. So if you're familiar with CPT or curricular practical training, that's done during the program of study and that's approved by the university's DSO. This one is a little bit different because it's approved by USCIS. And so as part of that, the requirements are pretty strict in terms of how to apply and when to apply. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. One thing to keep in mind when you're applying for OPT, when you're considering OPT, the position that you have does need to be directly related to your program of study. Now, what constitutes directly related, sometimes that's open to interpretation. So that's where it's going to be your responsibility to be able to determine or to be able to explain rather how the position's related. I'll give you an example. We have some students at my school who maybe are MBA students, but then they get a job as a software developer. And we say, okay, how's that related to your MBA program? And they say, well, in my role, I increase the amount of time people spend in the app because the more time they spend in the app, the more money they spend. So that increases revenue. So it's like, okay, there you go. You just made the relation. So just make sure, as you think about this, okay, how can I tie the positions that I'm applying for back to the program that I'm majoring in? So in order to apply for OPT, there are some eligibility requirements. First and foremost, you have to have been in the US for at least one academic year as an F1 student. So say you started in your home country, you did a year, and then you come to the US, and then you think, well, I've already completed a year with the university. Am I eligible now? And the answer to that is no. You need to be on F1 status for at least a year before you become eligible. There's also very strict requirements with your amount of CPT participation. So again, CPT is work authorization done during the program for credit. And if you do 1 year or more, even 366 days of full-time CPT, unfortunately, you lose all your OPT eligibility. And the way that USCIS defines part-time and full-time is a little bit different than how your employer will. USCIS defines full-time for international students as 21 hours per week or more. And I bring this up because I can't tell you how many times the students brought me an application for part-time CPT, but then it's 25 hours per week. And so I have to explain to them, well, the employer views part-time different than what USCIS does for international students. Unfortunately, it's just one of those many ways where international students have to go above and beyond and be super cognizant and aware of what their requirements are. So you can do less than full time, less than 12 months of full-time CPT. You can do as much part-time CPT as you want, so part-time 20 hours per week or less. But once you go over 12 months of full-time CPT, you lose your eligibility for OPT and STEM OPT. So make sure that you're planning for that during your program of study. Another important note, this like CPT, OPT is employment authorization for a US based company, and you need to be in the US to get that. That's most of you are doing that anyways. But then the other thing is that when you apply for post completion OPT, the first OPT after you graduate, you actually don't need a job offer at that point. You can apply for OPT, get the OPT, and you have up to 90 days of unemployment before you find, in order to find a position. So you do have time if you don't have an employment offer lined up yet. But then when you move on to the STEM OPT extension, at that point you do already need to have that employer ready, which most of you will because at that point you're already working with them through OPT. So I'll talk about the application process a little bit here, and then we'll dive into the different types because it does differentiate this process a little bit. But in general, the process for applying for OPT is first, you get a I-20 with an OPT recommendation from your designated school official. And you can check in with your school, your international affairs office, or the school website for how to request these and make sure that you're aware of processing times. In my past, I've had students that have come to me, 1 or 2 days before their status expires and they say, "Oh, I need an I-20. How with the OPT recommendation? How do I request it?" And that really causes things to break down because lots of times the university does have processing time. So, but I mean, look at this. It's the beginning of April and you're already in the presentation for this. So you're already one step ahead. You're already planning ahead. I love it. After you get the I-20 with the OPT recommendation, you're going to make your OPT application submission in USCIS. I highly recommend doing the website. There's no chance of it being lost like there is with a mail submission. And actually, USCIS has now they started charging more for a paper application as opposed to online. So you'll submit your application online. Assuming you get approved, you get an EAD card that stands for Employment Authorization Document card. It's redundant, but it's the government, so not everything makes sense. And that's your evidence that you have authorization to work. And then, assuming you then go on to STEM OPT, there will be certain reporting requirements, which I'll talk about in a second here. So as we consider the different types of OPT, this is going to be the very first thing for you to be aware of, like as you're getting ready to apply. There is pre-completion OPT, which is OPT done during the program of study. On the screen here, it says part-time or full-time options. But if school's in session, it's required to be part-time. You cannot do more than 20 hours per week while class is in session. But then during winter break, summer break, you could do full-time work authorization through pre-completion OPT if you decide. And then there's the more traditional one that most students do, which is the post-completion OPT. That's full-time only, 21 hours per week or more. And that's a 12-month authorization after you graduate. And then for students who are in STEM programs, you have the option to apply for an additional 24-month STEM extension. So sometimes students in STEM programs will say, "Oh, so I get 3 years of OPT." And that's kind of true, but to be proper about it, you get 1 year of post-completion OPT and then an additional 2-year extension after that. So it's really 1 plus 2. And then it's also important to note that for the STEM OPT specifically, you are required to have a company or be employed with a company that uses E-Verify. So, apply for OPT, get that first job, check with them if they're E-Verified. If they're not, that's okay. You can work with them during the post-completion OPT period, but you'll need to find a different employer that does use E-Verify before you can apply for the STEM extension. Now, I want to take a moment here to make an important note about pre-completion OPT because the time spent through this work authorization does subtract from your post-completion OPT. And I have the example in this middle here, for a student that does 3 months of pre-completion OPT, that 3 months is going to be subtracted from the original 12 months of OPT eligibility. So this student would only be eligible for 9 months of post-completion OPT. So if your school allows part-time CPT, I would highly recommend doing that because that does not impact your eligibility of your full 12 months of post-completion OPT. And again, you can do as much part-time CPT as you want, even more than a year. So if that option is available to you, that's what I would recommend. Going back to the application deadlines, if you're applying for pre-completion OPT, you can apply, whenever, as long as you've completed an academic year. Please keep in mind, processing time is typically 90 days. during the first Trump administration, we saw the processing time take longer. So it's yet to be seen if that's going to continue to happen this go around. Um, but if you're applying for the post-completion OPT, there's a very strict time requirement. You're required to submit no earlier than 90 days prior to your program end date and no later than the end of your grace period, 60 days after your program end date. So it's very, very tight. I've actually seen one student who applied 91 days before their graduation date and got denied for applying too early. Fortunately for that student, they got the notice while they were in their grace period, so they were still able to apply a second time and get approved. But be aware of that. And then for the STEM OPT, it's even more tight because, again, you're only able to apply 90 days before, but you have to apply before the OPT ends. So you cannot go into the grace period. Once the OPT expires, they won't reopen it for STEM. So just be mindful of that. Assuming you get approved, you'll get an EAD card. I already talked about that a little bit. When you're in STEM OPT, it's 24 months. You get approved for those 24 months all at once. Again, it does have to be related to the STEM learning outcomes of your degree. So make sure that there are STEM components to the position, even if it's not 100% STEM. At least there's STEM components to the position you can highlight while you're doing the I-983 plan. So this is something that you're going to have to do. You and your employer are going to have to fill out and submit that as part of your STEM application period. And then, that's going to go along with your submission. And every 6 months that you're on the STEM OPT, you're going to need to do a report, a check-in with your designated school official. And at the 12-month and the 24-month points, you'll need to submit updates to the I-983 where the employer lists progress as to how you're doing, with meeting the goals that were set out when you originally applied for STEM OPT. So that's about it for my portion. I know my time's running out. I want to be respectful of the H-1B portion, which is going to take a little bit more time. If you're interested in going deeper in this, like Gert mentioned, I have created the world's first DSO-led community exclusively for international students. So there's lots of communities out there, whether it be on Facebook or subreddits, things like that, that are, peer-led, and that's fine. But I've been through lots of those things, and sometimes the guidance can be a bit questionable. So, you can scan this QR code. You get a week free. I have a step-by-step guidance on, or a step-by-step training module on exactly how to go through the OPT application, like with screenshots. I literally take you screen by screen. That's in the training modules, along with work authorization guidance and a lot of other things. I have community message boards where I help keep you up to date with all the let's call it interesting stuff going on with the current administration. And I have a live weekly Q&A too, where I answer all your questions. So when Gordon came to me about this presentation, he kind of let me know everybody's situation and said, hey, these students mean a lot to me. Can we get them a good deal? So for today only, if you sign up today, I'm going to give you 80% off the normal subscription rate, and you can join for just $19 a month. And then again, you get that week free to kind of like take a peek and see, what it's all about. So that's all for me. Thank you for listening. I'll be around in the chat for questions and also, at the Q&A at the back end also. And then
Okay,
I guess I'll hand it over to Ernest now to talk about the OPT port or the H-1B portion of today.
great. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'll be discussing H-1B visas. And one second, please. Let me share my screen. Okay. So before starting the the discussion regarding H-1Bs, I would like to talk about what to do if your service record has been terminated. In the news recently, there's been reports of hundreds of students having their service records just suddenly terminated by USCIS or the government. So here's some just general tips just to help you in case you find yourself in a situation or if you know someone else who is experiencing this. So first, you should save and review your termination email for timing and details. Gather all legal documents if you've had any issues with law enforcement. So there's been certain individuals who've had their service terminated due to possibly DUIs or other events in their past. You should save for I-94 and collect your I-20s, visas, passport stamps, and other relevant documentation relevant to your status. Download your service and academic records if you can still access them. And then you should contact an immigration lawyer and just stay calm. And just some other things you should understand about service termination in your immigration status is that your service termination doesn't necessarily mean that you're out of status. So violation of status is different from being out of status or unlawful presence. So being out of status just means that your visa is expired, or perhaps if you entered as an F1 student and you're no longer attending schools, you might be out of status, but you're not necessarily obtaining unlawful presence. So the only way you could obtain unlawful presence is if USCIS or immigration judge determines that you're out of status. I mean, I have unlawful presence. So if you're experiencing this type of situation, just contact an immigration lawyer or a DSO to explore your options. So now that has been discussed, let's go into H-1Bs. So the objectives of this presentation is to explain what an H-1B visa is and its benefits, the process to obtain an H-1B, what happens after receiving your H-1B, and alternatives to an H-1B in case you are unable to obtain one. So this resource is for students, employers, HR representatives, so you can be familiar with the H-1B visa process and explain to prospective employers about what they need to do, or in case you're on an H-1B visa and you'd like to change your position, what the employer has to do. So what is an H-1B visa? It's a non-immigrant visa that allows U.S. employers to sponsor graduate level foreign nationals to work in certain specialty occupations. So these are roles that require specific skills and qualifications, and most importantly, an offer from a U.S. employer. So unfortunately, you cannot petition yourself. You will need an employer. There are certain visas that you can qualify for, that you can petition for yourself, and we'll discuss those later. But for an H-1B, you'll need an employer to petition you. So the benefits of an H-1B is that it allows you to work and live in the United States, at least for the maximum period. And for employers, it allows you to hire foreign talent. So the benefits of an H-1B visa are you have access to specialized U.S. jobs in high demand fields such as technology, engineering, healthcare, finance, and more. You can obtain competitive salaries and benefits. You can network and gain professional development opportunities. Family benefits such as spouses and dependent children under 21 can accompany you while you are on your H-1B employment. And most importantly, there is a path to U.S. permanent residency. So why is the H-1B so competitive? So the reason why an H-1B is so competitive is due to the annual cap. So for standard H-1B visas, there's an annual cap of 65,000. And for individuals with a U.S. master's degree, there's a cap of 20,000. So because there's more people that would like to obtain an H-1B than the spots available, this category is very competitive. Also, USCIS uses a lottery system in order to randomly select individuals for H-1B visa. So due to this, it is a very competitive visa to obtain. However, there are cap exemptions. So for certain positions, they're exempt from the caps I just mentioned before of the 65,000 for standard H-1B visa applications, as well as 20 or the 20,000 cap for master's degrees. So if you're a worker was already counted against the cap within the last 6 years, you're exempt. And also, if you plan on working for a U.S. institution of higher education, a nonprofit research organization, or governmental research organization, you are also exempt from this cap. Or let's say that the employer itself is not cap exempt, but the job is located at a cap exempt site, you still may be eligible for the cap exemption. So to make it easier to obtain an H-1B, make sure to include institutions of higher education, a qualifying nonprofit or research organization when job searching. Also, you should speak to an immigration lawyer just to make sure that the job will qualify. And lastly, just be open to moving anywhere to find a job. So certain students may focus on looking at major cities, but I would recommend that you just be very flexible in your job search. So what is the H-1B visa validity period? So H-1B visas are typically issued up to 3 years with a possibility to extend for another 3 years for 6 years in total. So extensions beyond that particular period may be possible, such as when a green card application is in progress. And a recent change now allows employment dates to start as early as 90 days before the beneficiary's authorized start date, which offers greater planning and flexibility. So, what are the educational and experience requirements for H-1B visa? So, to qualify, you must meet at least one of the following. You have to hold a U.S. bachelor's degree or higher in the relevant field, or hold a foreign equivalent of a U.S. bachelor's degree. You can possess a state license or certification to work in your field, or have a combination of training and experience equivalent to a U.S. degree. So you can also, regarding the experience requirements, so for each 3 years of employment experience you have, that's equivalent to 1 year of a university education. So to have the equivalent of a 4 years bachelor's degree, you would need 12 years of relevant progressive employment experience. So if you want to qualify for H-1B based on employment experience, just make sure that you have documentation establishing that you have this work experience, such as pay stubs, reference letters, employment contracts, and other documentation that establishes that you have the qualifying work experience. So what is a specialty occupation? So a specialty occupation is one that requires specialized knowledge and at least a bachelor's degree. So the role must be one of these criteria. So a degree must be normally required for the position. The role is complex enough that only a degreed individual can perform it. The employer always requires a degree for the role, or the duties are so specialized that a degree level education is assumed. So common fields include IT, engineering, marketing, science, law, and healthcare. And also new and emerging fields may also qualify as long as they meet one of the criteria above. So just because it doesn't fall into a traditional category or a traditional profession, it doesn't mean that it doesn't qualify as a specialty occupation. It just has to meet one the qualifications above. So, what are the employer responsibilities? So, employers have to take certain key steps before hiring an H-1B worker. So, the first step is to register with USCIS and pay the registration fee. So, this is registration in the H-1B lottery. The next step is after you're selected in the lottery is to file a labor condition application with the Department of Labor, certifying that they'll pay the prevailing wage. So what this is essentially saying is that the employer has to fill out an application detailing the job. So the job site, uh, the duties of the job, what the wage is going to be, and they have to send this documentation to the Department of Labor. And then once it's filed, the Department of Labor will confirm what is the minimum amount that has to be paid to the worker in this position. So this is to make sure that foreign workers aren't being paid less than a U.S. citizen. After this is done, you'll file, or the employer will file the H-1B petition, including full details on the job, the company, and the candidate. So let's talk about the step-by-step guide to the H-1B process. So the first, as mentioned previously, the first part is registration. So before anything starts, the employer has to register you in the H-1B lottery. So we just had the H-1B lottery this past March. So that would be the first step. The second step is the labor certification, as I just discussed. The third part is the petition filing. So after you have been selected in the H-1B lottery, the labor certification has been submitted to the Department of Labor and it's been approved. The third step is to file the petition with USCIS. And then once approved, the fourth and final step is a visa interview where you have to return to your home country at a consulate or embassy and interview in order to obtain an H-1B visa. So as mentioned before, the first step is the H-1B electronic registration. So each employer has to pay a registration fee for the workers they want to sponsor. This last year, it was $215 per person. And with the registration, you provide basic information about the company and the worker. And each applicant gets a unique number, so you get a fair shot. So you can't enter the H-1B lottery more than once. You only get one shot on being selected in the lottery. And once the registration closes, USCIS holds a lottery. If there are more registrations than visas available, which usually is what happens. Sometimes there might be one or two lotteries during the year. So let's say that there's still H-1B visas available after the first lottery. There might be a second or a third lottery. So it really depends on the year. The second step is the labor condition application. As we discussed earlier, this is just to make sure that you're going to be paid fair wages, that there's no strikes or labor issues at the job site, and current employees are informed about the new person that's going to be hired. It usually takes about a week to process, so happens really quickly. The third step is the full petition. As mentioned earlier, this includes information about the job, the company that's hiring the foreign worker, and proof that the worker qualifies for the petition for the position. So your degrees and experience. And then USCIS reviews the petition and makes sure that everything checks out. If they need more information, they'll request it, and this is known as a request for evidence. And if you're approved, you get a notice of approval. The final step is the visa interview. So once the petition is approved, the worker applies for a visa at the consulate or embassy in their home country. At the interview, the consular officer asks about the job and the person's background to make sure that everything lines up. And make sure that you're prepared because you might only be asked a few questions before a decision is made. Keep in mind that the consular officer has to interview a lot of people during the day to determine whether they qualify for whatever visa they're applying for. So yeah, just make sure that you're familiar with your job, your qualifications. There's this particular form called a DS-160 that you'll have to submit in order to obtain a consular or embassy interview. So make sure that the information there is accurate and it doesn't lead to the consular officer having any type of doubts or questions regarding your candidacy. So general tips for the H-1B visa interview are just know the basics. So understand your job in the H-1B process. So common questions are, where are you going to be working? What are your job duties? Who's the petitioning employer? What did they do? So make sure to review your application before submitting it to the officer at your consular or embassy interview. So practice your answers. So there are common questions. So just make sure that you're familiar with the questions you may be asked and just properly prepare your response. Just be confident and speak truthfully and clearly. Just make sure to never lie to a consular officer because it can lead to you being banned. And just make sure that your answers when you speak to the officer are consistent with what you've written in your petition, just professionally. So you don't necessarily have to. So business casual will typically be appropriate dress for a profession for a consular or embassy interview. Just make sure to stay calm and respectful. And then lastly, just show that you're excited to work in the United States. So once the visa is approved, the consulate will keep your passport to place the H-1B visa stamp inside. And it usually takes a week or two to get your passport back. If approved, the visa is added to your passport, and then you can return to the United States to start working. But also keep in mind that having a visa doesn't guarantee entry. So when you arrive, the U.S. border officers will check your documents. So it's a good idea to carry your approval notice, the visa, and a letter from your employer explaining your job. So changing jobs on the H-1B visa. So are you allowed to change jobs on the H-1B visa? Yes. Yes, you can change jobs. And the process will be similar. So basically, the employer will have to file a petition with USCIS in order to change your job. So it's basically you don't enter the lottery again. You don't have to go abroad to obtain a visa, but you basically do have to complete steps 2 and 3, as mentioned before. So your employer will have to submit the labor certification application to the Department of Labor, just confirming that the duties of the job. And then once that's approved, then the application can be submitted to USCIS, just detailing the job, your qualifications, and that's how you can change a job on H-1B. You can work as soon as the petition is filed, so you don't necessarily have to wait for it to be approved. You can work immediately. So concurrent employment is allowed with separate petitions. So under H-1B, you can have different employers petition you to work for their companies or organizations. But let's say that during your H-1B employment, you are laid off or fired. You have a 60-day grace period to find a new job before you have to leave the United States. And also, you're entitled to the prevailing wage and the same benefits as a U.S. worker. So, as stated with the LCA, you're submitting details about your job. So you're just to make so your employer is confirming with the Department of Labor that you're being hired with the same terms and conditions as a U.S. worker. So extending your H-1B and a path to a green card. So as mentioned earlier, a H-1B is valid for up to 6 years. So it's initially valid for 3 years, and then it's eligible for a second 3-year extension. So time that you spend outside the United States doesn't count toward the 6 years. So let's say that you have to travel abroad for whatever reason. This particular time period that you're not in the United States can be recaptured through documentation. So if this happens, just make sure to maintain documentation showing that you are outside the United States during your H-1B validity period. To stay longer, your employer is going to have to pursue a green card. So what has to be done is that a perm later certification has to be filed. So what this is basically showing that there are no qualified U.S. workers for the position. This process is very long and time consuming, so it can take a couple years to do. So if an employer wants to petition you for a green card, it's ideal to start the process early. And also during this process, the U.S. employer cannot lay off any U.S. workers. Otherwise, they have to start the process all over again. So it's ideal to start this process sooner rather than later. You don't want to get to year 5 of your H-1B status and this process hasn't been started yet. So understanding the cap gap extension for F1 students moving to H-1B status. So here's the problem. So you're an international student on an F1 visa. After graduation, you're working under OPT and your employer wants to keep you working long term and files a H-1B petition on your behalf. But what happens if your OPT ends before your H-1B status begins on October 1st? This is called the cap gap. So the U.S. immigration rules allows eligible students to remain in the United States during this cap gap period if the H-1B is filed on time, and if you're selected, you're maybe allowed to stay, and also you may be able to continue working until your H-1B status starts. So just be familiar with cap gap in case you're worried about your OPT status running out, but you're selected for the H-1B. So next, I want to talk about options other than an H-1B. So as stated earlier, it's difficult to get an H-1B visa due to the limited number available. So for the fiscal year of 2023, for example, the selection rate was higher. So around 20% of the individuals entered into the lottery were selected. However, with the most recent fiscal year, 2024, there were over 780,000 registrations for 85,000 available H-1B cap subject visas. So there was a selection rate about 15%. So with these numbers, it's useful to think about other options than the H-1B visa. So we're going to briefly talk about some of them. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, I can't discuss all of the qualifications involved, but generally speaking, you can enroll in another academic program. So basically extend your H-1B F1 status, excuse me. You can pursue a J-1 exchange visitor visa. You can look into obtaining an H-3 trainee visa. There's a TN visa, a L1 visa, an EB1A visa, and an EB2 national interest waiver. So you can also, so as mentioned earlier, you can enroll in another academic program. So basically pursue another F1. So by starting a new degree or certificate, you can maintain your F1 status. It resets your service record. New CPT, OPT may be possible with some restrictions. And also it gives you more chances to enter the H-1B lottery. So it's worth looking into pursuing another degree. And depending on your education, it may make it easier to qualify for some of the other options that I'm going to discuss. So there is the J-1 exchange visitor visa. So for internships, fellowships, or academic training. So it includes programs like cultural visits, etc. Some programs may require a 2-year home residency. So you might have to stay in your home country for 2 years before you qualify. So this is ideal for cultural exchange or training without full employment. There's the H-3 trainee visa, so for structured non-employment training programs. So the program must not be available in your home country. And there's an 18 to 24 month limit. So if you want to gain like hands-on experience with the U.S. organization, you may want to look into doing the H3 trainee visa. So, as mentioned before, to require uh, to qualify for this visa, the training cannot be available in your home country. It's not intended for productive employment, and it's valid for up to 2 years. So, and there's also a special category. So, if you're going to be working with children with disabilities, you may qualify for a special H3 visa. And there is an employment restriction. So, no work is allowed outside the approved training program. There's also a TN visa. So this is limited to citizens of Canada and Mexico. And to be eligible for this, you need to have a job offer and a list of profession and the necessary educational or and credentials. So almost all of the professions for a TN visa requires a 4-year degree or license. But there's a couple of categories where you can get by with just training or job experience. And the benefits of this is that it's valid for up to 3 years with unlimited renewals as long as the conditions are met. However, you cannot have the intention to permanently immigrate to the United States. So you need to have a residence abroad, or if you don't have that, just express that you don't plan to remain in the United States permanently. Then there's a L1 visa. So this is for intra-company transfers. So this visa allows multinational companies to transfer employees from foreign offices to the US offices. So for L1, this is for executives and managers. For L1B visas, this is for specialized knowledge employees. So in order to qualify, you must have worked for the foreign company abroad for at least 1 year within the last 3 years. And this can also lead to U.S. permanent residency through employer sponsorship. So one way this can help you is that let's say that you'd like to work in the United States, but you're having difficulty qualifying for other visas, or you're not selected for the H-1B visa. You can potentially discuss with a U.S. employer that has a branch abroad and explain the situation that if you work abroad for a year for the foreign branch or subsidiary or parent company, you can return back on L1 status and then potentially obtain a green card. So this might be an option. So make sure to discuss with an HR representative or other contact person with a company for the jobs that you're applying for. There's an O1 visa, which is for extraordinary ability. It's a temporary work visa. So this is for individuals with extraordinary ability in science, art, education, business, or athletics. So it requires proof of exceptional achievement. So some of the qualifications you can have are having awards related to your field of endeavor. You can have media coverage, expert endorsements. If you publish articles and these articles are cited by other professionals, if there's if you receive a high salary. So there's different ways that you can qualify. So you need to typically meet 3 of 10 criteria, or you can obtain, or if you're receive an award. So let's say that you receive like a Nobel Prize or a nationally or internationally recognized award, you can qualify. So this is used by artists, researchers, entertainers, and high-level professionals. You must have a U.S. employer or agent and a specific job in the United States. So for this category, you will need a U.S. Petitioning employer. And this can be extended in 1 year increments as long as you continue to work in the field. And then there's the EB-1A visa, which is for extraordinary ability. So this is very similar to the O1 visa as we discussed earlier. So this is for top talent in fields such as science, education, or athletics. For this, you don't need an employer. So you can self-petition for a green card. However, this requires extensive documentation of sustained acclaim and recognition. So, yeah, this is probably the most difficult visa to qualify for, but once you qualify, you get a green card. So, a lot of individuals try to start with an O1 visa since the qualifications are so similar and then build the case for EB1A over time. You can qualify, I mean, you can petition or submit an application for EB1A immediately. However, it's more risky. So typically, a lot of individuals just apply for O1 visa first and then try to apply for EB1A later on. And then there's a EB2 national interest waiver. So this is for individuals with advanced degrees or exceptional abilities in their field. So similar to the EB1A, as we discussed earlier, you don't need an employer offer or a sponsor. You can just self-petition. And you must demonstrate that your work benefits the U.S. national interest. So some examples include science, health, education. You may want to start a business. And it skips the labor certification process. So, as we mentioned earlier, in order for an employer to sponsor you under a traditional category, so under H-1B, the U.S. employer has to demonstrate that, look, we tried, but we cannot find a U.S. citizen that can work this position. So with the EB2 national interest waiver, you entirely eliminate this process. It's because it's basically saying that, look, this person's work is so important that it will be inefficient, it will be ineffective if we went through this process. Therefore, we are submitting this petition for a green card immediately. So this is common among researchers, public health experts, and STEM professionals. And so those are the overall uh, discussion regarding H-1B visas, the qualifications, the general process, and other options for remaining in the United States if you're not able to obtain an H-1B visa. So if you need any additional assistance, please feel free to contact me. So the information discussed earlier is not legal advice for your specific situation. It's just general information. So it's highly recommended that you speak to an immigration lawyer about your specific situation and to find out your best options. So if you're still on F1 status or you plan on, or you're close to graduating or you've already graduated and you want to determine your best options for obtaining a U.S. work visa, it's recommended that you speak with a immigration lawyer to find out your options. So you can contact my at my website. It's edwardslegalservices.com. You can just email me at ejedwards@edwardslegalservices. And you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. So I like to help students with during this process. So if you have any particular questions, just let me know and I'll try to address them during this meeting right now, or if you can think of something later, just contact me and I can write an article or do a video on the particular subject. So if there's any questions in chat, just let's see. Okay, just scrolling up. Okay, so at a recent conference, a Department of State official told us that the average visa interview was only 90 to 120 seconds, so be prepared. Yes, that's accurate. So can you clarify the costs associated for the employer seeking to petition an H-1B for potential new hires? You mentioned the fee to register with USCIS was $250 per person. Are there additional costs to employer that you should be aware of? Yeah, so you have to file the I-129. So it depends. So, and also for premium processing, there's also an additional fee. So for I know for premium processing, it's around $2,805 as at the time of this presentation. For the H-1B, it really depends on whether it's a capped exempt institution or the size of the employer. So for small companies with 25 full-time employees or less, you'll be assigned a particular fee. With larger companies, you're assigned another fee. So it can range from $700 to $1,000 for this particular fee. So yeah, it really depends on the size of the company, whether you want to pursue premium processing for a quick decision. So I hope that answers that particular question. Okay, let me see if I miss anything. Okay, right. So make sure you can check. So it says here, Ernest will probably be able to speak to this better, but if you'd like to reference the USCIS page on agent visa fees, you can find it here. Yeah, you can check with USCIS or an immigration lawyer about the particular fees for H-1B visa. So if we obtain an H-1B visa through a cap exempt organization, like a university nonprofit, are we restricted to working only in that sector in the future? For example, if I get an H-1B from a university, can I later move to a private company? So what can happen is that the private company can put you in the H-1B lottery again. So if you're working for a cap exempt institution, you have to work for another cap exempt institution. However, if you have another company that wants to sponsor you, uh, wants to enter you in the H-1B lottery, it will allow you to work for a non-capped exempt institution. That okay. Next question. So does the labor certification also include the part where the employer has to prove that the role for the foreign worker is getting hired cannot be filled by a U.S. citizen? Also, is this also applicable for the employer is hiring a master graduate? So for the H-1B process, the labor certification is just to make sure that the terms your employer, I mean, the terms of your employment are equal to that of a U.S. citizen. So that's only for the H-1B process. So once you're selected in the lottery, the labor certification application is sent to the Department of Labor just to make sure that based on the geographical area and the role, your job duties, that you're not being underpaid. But however, when you it's being sponsored for a green card with H-1B, then yes, during this process, your employer has to demonstrate that there's not a U.S. citizen that could work the particular job. So they do this by actively advertising. So there's a particular form that has to be submitted to the Department of Labor. It's similar where the job conditions and experience required is submitted to the Department of Labor. It typically takes about 6 months to process. And then at that point, the employer receives a documentation saying the prevailing wage. So this is the minimum that has to be paid to you to work that particular job. And then at that point, the employer has to actively recruit and demonstrate that there's not a qualified U.S. citizen that could work the particular job. And then after that process is done, then you then the application for a green card can be filed. Okay, next. So if a student has OPT without any pay, is it legal? Was the qualification for an employer to have an OPT student? Josh, do you want to answer that particular question?
Yeah, thanks, Ernest. So, post-completion OPT is allowed to be unpaid. STEM OPT is not. So, There's no specific requirement for a OPT employer like there is with H-1B. Ernest just kind of talked about how companies need to register with the government. They need to file for, the lottery. Any U.S. employer can hire an international student for OPT. So as for the post-completion OPT, I mentioned that when it comes to STEM, there are some heightened requirements. You do need to be paid, doesn't need to be an E-verified company. Um, Other than that, it's just, is it a valid US company? So, like, do they have a business license? And is the position directly related to your program of study?
Sure, we have a position related to the program study. Just not sure how to, I missed the part you answered before. So I'm not sure how to get qualification as a company to sponsor the student for OPT, or we don't need to do anything, or is there any legal thing we need to do?
Yeah, so you go through the OPT application process like I talked about. Then when a company hires you, when you get you can do it one of two ways. When you get approved for OPT, you'll receive an email to the email address you have in your CVIS record. And your DSO should be able to tell you what that is. Some schools default to the school email, others allow you to use your personal. But regardless, USCIS sends you an email so that you can create something called an OPT portal. And this is the only time as an international student where you can go in and directly update your record. So, you get approved for OPT, you get that email to set up an OPT portal. You do so, you get an employer, then you can access the OPT portal and input the employer information. Thank you for bringing that up. It's really important because on OPT, you're allowed 90 days of unemployment. You get an additional 60 days of unemployment if you get approved for STEM, the STEM OPT extension. Um, but you have to report an employer in order for the government not to perceive you as being unemployed. And one of the things that has happened in the CVIS information system where international student records are housed, since the Trump administration came in, now they actually have an unemployment tracker in the student's record in the OPT section. So make sure that you report the employer either through updating the OPT portal yourself, or additionally, your school is going to have some way for the DSO to report that for you. So you can contact your school's DSO office and ask them what you need to fill out so that they'll report the OPT for you. But again, once you have that employer, you could do it yourself because you'll have access to the OPT portal at that point.
Sure, sounds great. And based on this question, so I have find a potential company who can give me OPT, but and that company business is commission based. It's like broker. So if I don't do well, I won't have any salary and any pay. So if I'm doing well, I'm get commission. So it's legally it's okay, right?
So this is kind of wading into a gray area here. Our interpretation is that how you get paid is between you and the company, whether it be a W-4, a 1099, commission-based, hourly, salary. So at my institution, as long as the employer establishes that there's a working relationship, we're willing to log that as authorized employment.
Sure, thank you. So for OPT, is there any limit for working? I can work 40 hours, 20 hours, 60 hours. There's no limit. Or there's a
Post-completion OPT should be full-time, so a minimum of 21 hours per week.
Mm.
But there's no maximum. The only maximum there is the part-time CPT or pre-completion OPT that while school's in session, you're capped out at 20 hours per week. But once you get into full-time CPT or OPT, there's no regulatory cap. So you could feasibly be Elon Musk and work 100 hours a week. It doesn't say you have to work, less than this amount, but it's full-time is 21 hours per week or more.
Sure. So minimum is at least 21 hours a week.
Correct.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mhm.
So the next question is, I interviewed with a few higher education institutions that have sponsored before. However, after going through the interview process, they said the position wasn't eligible for sponsorship. I have a year plus left in my STEM OPT. How should I get around this issue? So it depends on why they said the position wasn't eligible for sponsorship. So it's unclear whether it's the institution's policy itself or if they were talking legally. So legally, there would be no issue with them for sponsoring you for H-1B cap exemption. So as discussed earlier, institutions of higher education, such as a university, would constitute a cap exempt institution. So it may be that they are unfamiliar with the law. So one thing you could do to try to get around this is just explain, look, under H-1B visas, universities are considered cap exempt institutions. Therefore, I would be eligible for H-1B uh, position. So it really depends. So that's what I would try to recommend, just trying to inform them about the law, because some employers, some higher HR representatives aren't familiar about H-1Bs or other ways to hire foreign workers.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Unfortunately, some employers are, I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, but they're very uneducated about this topic. So it's a lot easier for them to just say, oh, we can't do that, and move on to something they're more familiar with. So yes, you can try to educate them. And another option in the short term, if you're concerned about hitting that 150 days cap of unemployment, is saying, I don't need sponsorship right now. I already have work authorization through STEM OPT. I'm just looking for a job offer. Now, obviously, lots of international students are looking for sponsorship in the long term, but if your short-term needs get to the point where you need employment, you could differentiate that for them also. I'm not looking for sponsorship. I'm just looking for employment right now. I already have the work authorization through STEM OPT.
Thank you.
Okay,
And
so
yes,
last,
I've seen I've seen the next question about the bill that's been introduced to eliminate OPT. So a quick civics lesson. In the US, there's a lot of steps for something to become a law. It does have to get introduced. That's step one. Then it needs to get brought to the floor. It needs to be voted on. It needs to be passed by both chambers of Congress. Then it needs to go to the president's desk to get signed. These processes are not fast. They take a long time. So it is something that I'll be keeping tabs on. But and Ernest, maybe you want to wade in here. I don't foresee a immediate threat just because we're so early in the process here.
yeah, I agree with Josh. So a lot of different bills are proposed. They never go anywhere. During Trump's first term, he mentioned different immigration proposals that were ultimately unsuccessful. So yes, while it's concerning that this bill was proposed, it's at this particular point is not anything to be worried about, I don't think.
Thanks, Ernest. And then Alicia's question. Again, I would highly recommend doing at least 21 hours per week while on OPT, because then it becomes deemed full time by USCIS standards. Like think about it from the government's perspective for a minute, right? Like you're a non-immigrant, you're granted status here in the US to study, and now you're extending your status by an extra year to work 20 hours a week. It's not ideal. So I would highly recommend you get that up to at least 21 hours per week so it can be considered full-time employment. Not for international students, Rashad. For international students, USCIS designates part-time is 20 hours per week or less, and full-time is 21 hours per week or more. It's a different standard for international students, just to make things more complicated for all of you.
Are there any additional questions?
Gary, we have this question is for you, brother.
Yeah. I've heard this question a lot. I know we have been saying like on our LinkedIn and on our Instagram that we are gonna go live in the next 2 weeks, and that's what we have been expecting as well. But like I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we have a few developers on board who are working very hard to just make sure that the website is working, and also that once we go live and give every one of you access to the platform, that there will be enough jobs available. Um, so yeah, it's hard to tell. We are super close now. Will be 1 max 2 weeks most likely, but also keep an eye out on our Instagram and on our LinkedIn for updates. But like I said, we are like our developers are working very hard to make sure everything is ready for you guys. But if you have any other questions regarding it, please just reach out to me on LinkedIn or an email. But we are working very hard on it.
And I see Prashika has a question about working during summer school. So if you have pre-completion OPT, school's not in session over summer, you can work 40 hours. Another thing we didn't really touch on today is on-campus employment. So say you go to like one of these big schools with 10, 20, 30,000 students, there's lots of on-campus positions for you. On-campus employment needs to be 20 hours per week or less. You do not need CPT for that. You can just do that automatically. Same rules apply as pre-completion OPT. If school's not in session, you can go above part-time. So say you're working in the bookstore on campus, summer break, yes, you could work 40 hours through on-campus employment. All right, now we have a tax question in here. I'm not qualified to speak to tax issues. Ernest, are you?
Unfortunately, I'm not. So this, unfortunately, I won't be able to answer this question.
Yeah, so Sprint Tax is a good resource if you're looking for tax professionals. I know you go to like H&R Block or you try to use, some of the other like online systems and they're not really set up for international students. Sprint Tax, one word, is a tax service that does understand the nuances for international students. So you can look into that. Yes, Prashika. So again, if it's an on-campus position, so you don't need CPT because it's on campus, and then school is not in session. While school's not in session, you can exceed 20 hours per week. And then when school resumes, you'd have to go back down to 20 hours per week or less.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions? If you don't think of a question now, but something oh, I see there's one question. But if something later comes to your mind, please just reach out to me, to Ernest, or to Josh. I'm sure everybody shared like their contact information if you want any further questions answered. But I see here, Josh, that there's one more question, or Ernest, whoever wants to take it regarding H-1B.
And okay, so this question says, can we legally work deals with companies for H-1B? Could you clarify your question, if possible? Partly paying for it. So typically, no. Yeah, typically your employer has to sponsor you for the H-1B so that they pay for the process. Okay, so I hope that answers that particular question.
All right. I think that should be it, guys. Like I mentioned, if you have any other questions in the future, just reach out to me, to Ernest, or to Josh, and we will post this meeting tomorrow on our YouTube channel. But we will make a post on our LinkedIn if you want to rewatch it. We plan to do more webinars in the future. We have one planned in 2 weeks, which we will post about in a few days on our LinkedIn channel, um, about different visa topics for F1 students, to make it easier for you guys to navigate the visa process, as it is just super complicated. So yeah, any final thoughts, Ernest or Josh?
I mean, my final thought is everyone here is already doing the right thing. You're taking steps to be informed ahead of time. So just keep that up and keep asking those good questions because now's not the time to take chances. You want to be informed. So everyone's doing things the right way. And thank you again, Gert, for having us.
Yeah, my final thought is that the immigration process is very complicated, not to mention with all the additional changes. So just make sure to seek legal help when you can. Yeah, you don't want to miss an important benefit that you could have qualified for if you had legal representation.
All right, guys. Thank you everybody so much, and stay tuned for updates on our LinkedIn and on our Instagram. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah, everybody.